who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz of LSAT Unplugged, but our focus tonight is not the LSAT. It is law school prep and law school success, how to succeed and prepare the summer prior. And when I was thinking about who to bring in to support students in the next stages of their journey, I thought who better than Lee Burgess of Law School Toolbox. She's been doing this for many years, as long as I can remember, and I've been in the LSAT world for quite some time. So Lee, do you want to share just a little bit about what you do at Law School Toolbox and Bar Exam Toolbox before you dive in for your talk tonight?
Absolutely. Thanks everyone for being here. So as Steve said, my name is Lee Burgess, and I'm the co-founder of the Law School Toolbox and the Bar Exam Toolbox. We help law students and those folks studying for the bar exam find academic success through online courses. We have very popular podcasts, and we also offer one-on-one tutoring programs. So we can really help you from getting ready to start that first semester of law school, so that 0L, as we call it, all the way to hopefully killing it on the bar exam. And so it's been a lot of fun. And yeah, I think we've been doing this now for like 12 or 13 years. I don't know. The years just add up quickly. It's amazing how that happens.
Amazing. Well, I'm so excited for your presentation tonight. I'll leave it to you to take it away. And folks, please feel free to type questions in the chat, and Lee will either work them into the conversation as appropriate or save them till the end depending. So Lee, I assume you're cool with questions?
Cool with questions. Love a good question.
Awesome. Yeah, that really makes an interactive experience for all of you. So dive right in, Lee, take it away, and I hope you all enjoy.
Great. Okay, so I really love a good list. Anyone who knows me knows I love a good list. So I love like 5 things, 10 things to do. So in prepping for this talk, what I wanted to do is come up with kind of 5 main tips for getting ready to start law school. And so my first one that I wanted to start with was picking the right law school for you, which is what a number of people are doing right now in this kind of law school universe. It is everybody's getting their acceptance letters and they are kind of deciding where to go. I get a lot of emails from listeners or people who are familiar with our work about where they should go to law school. So if that is you or someone you know, I really want to encourage you when you start making that choice to don't get hung up on like the rankings or just the straight up prestige of the school, because I think there are a lot of things you want to consider about where you go to law school. You want to think about the culture of the school. Different schools have very, very different cultures, and you want to make sure that the culture of the school agrees with you. You want to think about what law, if you know what kind of law you want to practice or what sort of passion you have, you want to make sure that whatever school you're going to is going to allow you to lean into that passion. So for instance, if you want to do fashion law and you have an opportunity to go to Fordham and you have an opportunity to go somewhere else, but Fordham has a fashion law program, then I think you should probably go to Fordham because that's going to probably get you closer to your goals, even if you got into a more prestigious school. So it's not always as easy as just get into the quote unquote best school that you got into, because you really want it to be a great fit for you. Depending on the size of the school, you also want to think about where it's located. I was just talking to someone who was deciding between law schools in Northern California and Southern California. I'm in Northern California, and we were talking about the pros and cons based on where you want to practice, because where you go to school often lends itself to where it's easier to get a job because the alumni network is a lot stronger. So sometimes you want to think regionally, especially if you're not going to kind of the rarefied air top 10 law schools. You want to think about where you want to practice and whether or not that school is going to give you the network to do what you want to do in the area of the country that you think you want to do it. Another thing that I think is really important to talk about is money, because law school is super expensive. And I really didn't appreciate until I started talking to a lot of different folks about this. My business partner is very passionate about this. If you are getting some sort of academic scholarship at one school, you can negotiate to try and get more money if you have multiple offers for scholarships. And you would be wise to do so, because if you are going to take out loans for your law school experience, and if you aren't really familiar with how big of a deal those loans are as they kind of compound over time, it is really worth sitting down and thinking about what an extra $7,000 in scholarship money could mean when you start thinking about interest and how things are going to get paid off over time. So, there are definitely practical considerations that you want to think about when you are picking your law school. And I think you just want to realize that life is short and this is going to be 3 years of your life. And so try and go somewhere that you're going to be excited about, be in a city or a location that you enjoy, where you think you're going to get, great exposure, great experience. It doesn't need to be miserable. A lot of people talk about how hard law school is. I think law school can be a lot of fun if you set yourself up right for it. So just make sure that you really thoughtfully think through where you want to go to school, because it is a very big decision. All right. Number 2 on my list, once you know you're going to go to school and you have picked your school, you know how much it's going to cost, now you have to go there. And I think one of the things that's often not discussed enough about starting law school is what it's like to relocate to start law school. Oftentimes folks have been working, you might have taken some time off between undergrad and graduate school. That's what I did. And now you're back trying to figure out housing, and you might be moving to a city that you've never lived in before. And a lot of times folks can leave housing decisions until the last minute. And I think this is a terrible idea because law school's super busy, and there's no ramp up period when you start law school. It's you read for class on day 1 and the work kind of starts. And so you really want to have your life in order so you can get things kicked off on day 1. So things to consider about housing. Does your school provide housing? If so, what's the process for getting access to that? Do you think it's going to be a nice place for you to live? Is it going to feel safe? Are you going to feel safe walking around the neighborhood in which your housing and your school is in? So that's something you want to think about. If you're not used to living in a city and you're moving to a city for law school, what is that going to look like? And what does urban life look like? And is that going to be a different experience for you? My business partner went to school in New York and she'd never lived in New York before. And then there were all these considerations about do you want to pay more to live in a building with a doorman? Because that has kind of changes the living experience. And then she ended up living on-campus housing. And but there was definitely friends of hers that were couch surfing until they could find them a spot. I mean, you want to avoid a lot of chaos if you can, because the chaos is very exhausting and it makes kind of a challenging time a bit more challenging. So you want to explore your options and try and figure it out. Are you going to live with roommates? If so, how are you going to meet them? And are you going to be able to have a space that you're going to study in your apartment? Also, don't underestimate the amount of time that it takes to set up a home, with things like internet, utilities, all of that stuff. You want to get your process all set up before school starts. Make sure you know which grocery store you're going to go to. All of that kind of stuff is very important, because if you aren't happy about your living situation and feeling that your life is in order, it's going to up your anxiety, and you don't need that. Law school is challenging enough as it is. If you are moving from far away, other things you have to consider is how are you going to afford to ship all your stuff? Are you driving out there? Are you going to get a U-Haul? If you're moving to especially a city, are you going to bring a car? If so, what do you do with that car? I can say, as somebody who went to law school in San Francisco, that I had a budget specifically for parking tickets, because you always get parking tickets in San Francisco, no matter how hard you try not to. And so I just had to build in the budget that if I was going to have my car in the city, that it was going to continue to get parking tickets. So things like that are really important to just keep in mind. Are you going to have a bike? Are you going to bike to school? Are you going to walk to school? Are you going to take the bus? You really need to think about it. Other things you want to think about with your relocation, your life plan, are community activities. What do you do for fun outside of going to school? So do you play tennis? Do you go work out at a gym? Do you do yoga? Do you have religious activities that you do? Do you like book clubs? All of this stuff is really community based, and you don't necessarily want your whole community to be law school. A lot of your community is going to be law school, but I think that it can be really fulfilling to have non-law school folks that you spend time with while you're doing something challenging, because it keeps you grounded. And I think that is very important. So if there are things that you do that kind of fill you up, then you want to make sure that you have time to do that. So start researching it as soon as you know where you're going to go, and try and meet some people, join a running club, a dog walking group. It can be so many different things, but that sense of community, I think, is really important. You also have to just think about other things like food. I always joke that law school felt like high school again, because my law school didn't have great lunch options. And I had a locker and I brought my lunch to school. And I know this sounds really silly, but like, it was a little weird after being a professional for a number of years to kind of go back and be making my lunch every day, because the salads that they had in the little shop on the law school campus were terrible and incredibly expensive. And so you want to kind of learn about what food options are. You're going to eat a lot of pizza at law school. Like, pizza is the official food of every law school campus. I think if you ask anyone who's been through law school, you can be like, how much pizza did you eat? And none of us want to acknowledge how much pizza we ate over those 3 years. And so I will say that as much as you will eat a lot of free pizza, you don't just want to be on a pizza diet, because it's not going to make you feel very good. So you do want to have a plan. So that's just like a little bit of starting to get these juices flowing about like, how are you going to relocate? How are you going to set up your life? The better you set up your life, it's going to, to flow, and it's not going to be added stress. There's more stuff in your life that you need to get into order as well. So my third tip is to really make sure that the rest of your life is in order as much as it can before school starts. Things like doctor's appointments, dentist appointments, optometrist appointments, like all of that stuff. You do not want to be missing class or trying to squeeze that in during the semester. Do all of that stuff during the summer. If you get any sort of accommodations for learning differences, for anxiety, for any sort of really any variety of things, one of the things that you're going to need to do is apply for accommodations. So you get testing accommodations, and most of that requires quite a bit of documentation. So if you see a psychiatrist, but you haven't talked to them in a while, you probably want to let them know that you are going to law school and you're going to need that documentation. You need to make sure that you kind of have all of these ducks in a row, because you don't want to create some sort of fire drill about trying to get your accommodations stuff sorted when you are getting ready for, like, let's say midterms, if your school has midterms. So that's something else that you really want to keep in mind. I know this kind of seems silly, but like, do you have one suit? Everybody needs to have at least one suit when they start law school, because you're going to get invited to some sort of event. This is even before you're interviewing for jobs. So if you don't have one suit, I don't think you need lots of suits, because I think you can make one suit look like a lot of different suits, and you don't want to spend a ton of money, but you need to have some professional clothes. And so if you haven't been working in a professional environment where you've collected some of that stuff, then that's another great thing to do over the summer. Do you have like a nice black, navy blue suit or pinstripe? Really, the plainer the suit, the better, because then you can change it up with what you put with the suit, and then no one will recognize that it's always the same suit, which is fine. But you do need to make sure that you have something. So if you get invited to something, a networking event, that you have the appropriate clothes to wear. You also want to make sure your computer is stable. You don't necessarily need to buy a new computer, but if your computer is on its last leg, you definitely don't want computers dying on you during the first semester. So make sure you have at least a solid working computer. You also want to think about how you're going to take notes. I'm a big proponent. My business partner is a big proponent of handwriting notes. And I meant to bring it with me, but I think I left it at my home office. But I'm kind of into the new Kindle Scribe, which allows you to take like notes on notebooks and you can like email them to yourself. I think it's actually like, it's got a stylist and I think it's better than the iPad for taking kind of handwritten notes. I'm super into it. And so, do you want to like learn about some different electronic note taking options? But we're going to talk a little bit more about class notes in a minute. But what you don't want to do is just, basically become a court reporter in your classes and just type. Some professors are eliminating laptops in the room because they want you to pay more attention. But you do want to think about how you're going to take notes and do you have all the technology that you need? Other things, I'm a big fan of systems and automation. So automate everything so you don't, I mentioned my parking ticket problem, like you don't want late bills. Like we all have the technology now to be able to automatically pay everything. Just sit down and set all of that stuff up once, because the semester is going to get cranking and you, don't want to waste money because you don't have all your kind of ducks in a row about that kind of stuff. But you also just don't want to be like, you don't want to have like an email from your landlord because you forgot to pay your rent or this or that. Just automate it all. It's magical. Okay. So that's kind of my top 3 tips about kind of, picking the right law school for you, kind of getting, your relocation plan done and making sure your life is in order. Any questions before I move on to my next tip? All right. Okay. The next thing, and you may have heard about this, is like, should you be doing stuff to prepare over the summer? And, it depends on who you talk to. The short answer is if you want, but you don't have to. And so there are different options, but I want you to think about kind of what you're doing over the summer and whether or not you think it's going to benefit you. So there is this idea that a lot of folks want to focus on like learning some law before school. And I don't think that's the best use of your time. If you want to work on anything, work on your skills that can be applied to law school. Like reading a book on tort law is just not really going to make much of a difference when you go to class. Yes, you might have a more basic understanding of what tort law means, but your professor's teaching it in a very specific way. We're going to talk in a minute about how they teach. And so just like, you don't need to go learn all the law. You're going to learn it in school. So that's not as much of the focus. Really, I think you want to focus on skills. So skills, in my opinion, are like reading, writing, organizing your life, taking solid class notes, understanding how you write essays, like all of those kinds of things are skills, and some other life skills too. So at my company, we have something called our Start Law School Right course, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more later, which is a skills-based course where we kind of give you a little bit of a sampling of each part of the law school experience. So you can like see what it feels like to sit in a class, see what it feels like to write a brief, see what it feels like to do an outline, see what it feels like to write an essay. But learning the law is not really the point of that. It's really just, do you have the skills to kind of manage the process? Other skills you want to think about is if your grammar skills aren't really where you need to be, if you're worried about your writing skills, you might want to invest in the old Strunk and White, like tiny book that still is kind of the end all be all. It's called The Elements of Style, about using correct grammar. You do want to make sure that your writing is solid, and that is the way that lawyers communicate mostly. And so you want to feel like that your writing style is where it needs to be. Another thing that we think is important is to do kind of some dense, challenging reading. And it doesn't have to be on the law necessarily, but you need, if you don't read a lot, or if you do what many of us do now and only read things on our phones, you want to like dust off a paper book or your Kindle and really read something that you have to read every word and not skim, because it is actually a skill. Reading is a skill that we can kind of lose, and our modern life is so about skimming, and skimming is not how you can do your reading for class, and read cases for projects and things like that. So it can be a great time to buy a dense book, or books that are kind of loosely associated with law school, but reading and kind of getting up your stamina for reading, I think is great. A book that I read last year that's on the Constitution that I think is great is by Elie Mystal, who is funny, it's smart, it's all about the Constitution. I think that's a great book. But really, just read something that's challenging that you can't skim. Also, I think it's a great time to spend energy thinking about your mindset. If you've never been exposed to Carol Dweck's work, she has a great book called Mindset, which talks about the difference. What she's really talking about is why it's important to have a growth mindset. It helps us move through failure. It helps us deal with challenging situations. It's really a key because you are going to hit a stumbling block in law school. Law school is hard for almost everyone at some point, and you want to be able to kind of have some of the skills of how you're going to manage those stumbling blocks if they happen. So that's another great book that I highly recommend. Another book that I'm kind of obsessed about right now is called Dopamine Nation. Also has nothing to do with the law, but it is a great book about how our brains are kind of being reprogrammed due to the high dopamine nature of our lives right now. But since most law students struggle with things like anxiety, the legal profession has high rates of depression and things like that. I think that having some more skills and understanding about how our brains work and process information and how that relates to our anxiety is really amazing. So I highly recommend Dopamine Nation. It's one of my most recent favorite reads. I also think it's a really great idea to just do something that you've never done before. Like get out of your comfort zone, push yourself to do something. It doesn't really matter what it is, take a pottery class. A couple of years ago, I took my son to a rock climbing gym, and then I ended up having to do the rock climbing, which I'd never done before. And I was like, oh, look at me being uncomfortable. I didn't really plan on rock climbing myself, but law school is all about getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, getting called on, being wrong. That happens to almost everyone in law school. And so you really want to just kind of get used to challenging yourself and feeling like you can work through kind of these harder moments and little stumbling blocks. Oh, someone was asking about the second book. Let's see. So I mentioned, Elie Mystal's Dopamine Nation and Elements of Style, and then Carol Dweck's book, which is called Mindset. So do something different. Like it doesn't really matter. Train for something, do Duolingo. I think law school is a lot like trying to study a foreign language. So it can be good to practice something like that. Anyway, so try something new. Other things, if you do want to hear a little bit more about law, get a little bit more of exposure, we have a very popular podcast called the Law School Toolbox podcast, which has tons and tons and tons of episodes on getting ready for law school, doing law school. And then we have a series called Listen and Learn, which is where I teach very specific areas of the law and then apply it to a fact pattern. So you can kind of see how you do this linking of law to facts, which is really what you're going to need to do in your exams. A lot of folks enjoy those. They're nice, bite-sized, usually 15-minute episodes. So if you do want to get a little more exposure to the law, if the law just seems really foreign to you, that can be a nice way to just understand the terminology and the terms of art and just kind of hear us talk about it. Okay. So, any other questions about kind of what you should be doing this summer before? Okay. All right. So my last tip is really just this idea, a little bit of a primer about how to think about this semester. So when you start your semester, don't lose sight of the end goal. So here's where law school is a little bit tricky. Law school can feel like a ton of busy work. You read these cases, like a lot of cases sometimes, which is supposed to teach you the law. It's a very inefficient way to learn anything. So like you might be saying like, couldn't I just read a book that would explain the law to me? Well, yes. And there are things called commercial supplements that kind of do that, but that's not how we teach lawyers because we want to be able to read case law. Case law drives so much of the work that we do out in the real world. And you're really learning how to be a lawyer in all of these classes. So you can really get caught up in reading the cases. And then after you've spent all this time preparing for class, taking notes on the reading, then you go to class and the teachers and the professors still aren't going to mostly lecture to you exactly what the law is going to be. Many of them, although some kind of more progressive professors are using PowerPoints and kind of outlining the law, but the older school professors are still using the Socratic method, which is a question-based teaching style, which is, if you've watched any movie or read any book about law school, this is where they, call you out by your last name and you have to stand up. And then every single person has a story about screwing up in front of the whole class and feeling like that you're like everybody's going to remember, and no one remembers is the life lesson. No one except you. Like I can tell you exactly when that happened to me. It was my first semester criminal law class. I can tell you what the question was about. I mean, my memory of that is very vivid. No one else has any clue what I'm talking about, including the professor who was my mentor. And I mentioned to him like the following year, how traumatic that was. And he was like, I literally have no idea what you're talking about, Lee. I have no idea. And I was like, cool. I'll stop talking then. I don't need to refresh your recollection. But really, I mean, I think it's just part of it is just getting used to being in this environment. We do have one more question, I think, about the podcast, the Listen and Learns, which were the episodes I was talking about. All of that is available on the podcast, which is available all the places that podcasts are available. We also have a podcast archive on our website, lawschooltoolbox.com, and you can search by topic and kind of go through and pick and choose episodes that you think are helpful. Okay, so you do the Socratic method. They call on you, Ms. Burgess, can you tell us about the facts? Ms. Burgess, can you tell us what the defendant argued? And you're nervous and sometimes you're wrong, but you muddle through. And it is, again, not the most efficient way to learn. So you just need to understand what the professors are doing and make sure that you are listening for the right stuff to go in your class notes. Because as I mentioned earlier, we don't just want to be court reporters. We don't want to take dictation about what is happening in the classroom. What so often students do is they forget that they're supposed to be thinking and processing in class. So they're just like, I'm just going to write it down. Everything the professor says must be important. Much of what the professor says is important. Much of what your peers say is not as important, especially in the beginning when most people are wrong, because you're like, they don't have any more specialized knowledge than you do. But you want to be thinking about what you include in your notes. It's the takeaways. It's the things that you're learning, not just frantically writing down everything that's been said. Because if you do that in class, then you're not really listening. You're not really processing information. And that's going to make it harder to go back and study the material. Okay, so you read all these cases, slightly inefficient, feels like a lot of busy work. Then you go to class and they teach you by asking questions, which is not necessarily feels like the easiest way to learn. And then you're supposed to create something called outlines that everybody talks about, which are really just study materials where you take all the stuff that's covered in your class and you condense it down into something that you can memorize. So outlines can look like a linear outline. They can look like a flow chart. They could look like lots of different things, depending on how you learn. But the idea is you have to create your own study materials to learn the law. Now, there are books that will have study materials, but every professor teaches the law slightly differently. And part of what you're trying to do is to really make study materials, understanding what your professor thinks is important, and how they are teaching you the law that you want to apply to fact patterns. So when you hear outlining, that's really the studying piece that you do outside of class time. And we call this deep work, but this is where you kind of wrestle with the material. And one of the big mistakes that law students often make is they wait till the end of the semester to do their outlines instead of working throughout the entire semester and building these outlines as they go. Really, after a few weeks of class, you have enough law to kind of start building these study materials. And so you want to do it slowly over time, so you're not frantically trying to learn all the material at the end of the semester. All right. Then after you've done that, then when it comes to an exam, you don't just write a report on all the law that's in your outline. The professor is going to typically give you a fact pattern, and then you're going to have to write about the legal issues that are found in that fact pattern, and then applying the law and arguing the facts. So I have just a very short, tiny fact pattern just to give you a tiny snippet of what something like this sounds like. So this is a criminal procedure fact pattern that's just, I think it's really about one issue. So one summer afternoon, Officer Prowl saw Dan wearing a fully buttoned up heavy winter coat running down the street. Officer Prowl ordered Dan to stop. Dan complied. As Officer Prowl began to pat down Dan's outer clothing, a stolen car radio fell out from underneath. Officer Prowl arrested Dan and took him to the police station. Can Dan successfully move to suppress the radio from being introduced into evidence and at trial? So this is very short. This is like a little snack, like a hypo snack. The thing is, what your exams look like is like that little snack, but it's like a page or a couple of pages long, depending on how your professor is writing their hypotheticals. So this is like about one issue, right? We're talking about this stolen car radio and whether or not it's admissible. But you notice that the question didn't say like, talk to me about how things are admissible at trial, right? It didn't ask about that. It asked about like what's going to happen in this specific fact pattern. And so the way that you answer it is you have to go back into your brain and into those outlines and say, what is the law that I have learned in my classes that applies to this situation? And then what are the facts in here that I should apply to that law? And then I'm going to argue the outcome that I think is going to be the correct outcome and why. So I think that it's really important to understand that that's the end result of what your exams are going to look like. This idea that you're using these fact patterns and you're not just writing like a treatise on admissibility of evidence. You are working fact patterns and applying a lot of law to the facts. So this is just a tiny little snack to give you a picture of what a fact pattern will look like. Okay. So another thing you want to think about in your first semester is that sometimes professors don't give midterms. And so the first time that you really get any solid feedback from your professor on a practice exam is the exam, which is terrible because you don't want your first feedback to be your grade, which is typically graded on a curve to other students in the class. So when you get to school and you start seeing postings for things like an academic support office, which usually helps students with their study skills, when your professors have office hours, when they hand out fact patterns to do in class, you want to start practicing with those fact patterns and making sure that you understand how to apply the law to the facts. Now, that's not to say that it's all going to come together week one, but you really want to make sure that you're practicing throughout the semester. You can go to your professor and ask about practice. Sometimes they will give you feedback. Sometimes they won't. You can sometimes get feedback from an academic support office. You may have TAs that work for your classes. You can work with private tutors like we have that are able to give you a lot of feedback. The key is whatever happens, you want to not have your first round of feedback be graded. And so it's on you to figure out what are the resources available to you and make sure that you are practicing and getting feedback as much as possible. The other thing that I wanted to mention was through the whole semester experience, and this is going to include like a legal writing class and then, all these activities that happen in school. It is so easy to just get caught up on working hard and not necessarily working smart. So as you start your law school experience, really think about creating systems for yourself and constantly checking in with yourself about the activities that you're doing that are working for you, that are getting you towards your goals. One of the reasons why practice and getting feedback is so important is that's the way you learn if what you're doing is actually teaching you the law. And if it's not, you want to have time to pivot. So really check in with yourself on a regular basis, see how it's going, and then, change it if it needs to be changed. This first semester of law school is really the time where you get to test a lot of different techniques and see really what works for you. So those are my 5 pockets of tips for getting ready for your first semester of law school. And now I'd like to open it up for questions.
I'll dive in with one for you, Lee. Thank you for the great presentation and conversation, by the way. You really ran the gamut. I was expecting a lot on the summer before, but you went far beyond that, not just into the content of what to prep for, but also the life stuff as well, how to choose a school, living situation, all that stuff, which I think is often underemphasized. The students are in for a rude awakening when they arrive. So I do have a question for you, which is, because I know that I always get questions on this. You addressed it. I want to just hear you say it again, though.
Yeah.
Learning the law prior to the fall semester. I imagine students being, okay, this is on the syllabus. These are the books I have to get. I'm going to order them online. I'm going to order them in June. Some not so light beach reading. Tell everyone exactly why it's not a good idea to try to learn the law on your own before the semester starts. I can imagine the counter argument here, wouldn't it be useful to have some familiarity with the classic cases that are typically covered? I go on the law school memes for T14's Facebook group, and I see they're always mentioning these particular cases. These are undoubtedly going to show up in law school. Why shouldn't I at least go on Wikipedia and familiarize myself with the facts of that situation?
Because you're really looking for a big picture in the end. So there are all of these cases that we all learned, Penoyer versus Neff, Carroll towing. I mean, there's stuff that everybody reads the same exact stuff, but they're going to teach it to you in school. That's one of the reasons why you're paying all this money, is to sit in these classrooms with these professors and learn not only these individual cases, but how all the law fits together. And some of these cases that are the most famous cases are very old, and the law isn't really necessarily the law anymore. I mean, or it's just a legal theory that they want to apply, or it's a reasoning. There are lots of different reasons why these cases are famous. And your professors and the individuals who build these case books, because they edit these cases, you also don't want to just read cases without them being edited, unless you have a lot of free time, because they're very long. Most of them are very, very long. They're being edited and put together to teach some sort of story. They're really telling you a story of how the law fits together. A well-edited case book gives you law that kind of builds on each other. And so it's less about I've read Penoyer versus Neff. I understand Penoyer versus Neff. This is the seminal case. It's much more about why is Penoyer versus Neff important, and why does it fit into this greater narrative? Most people will not cite Penoyer versus Neff on their exam answer because it's super old. It's just very famous, and it's part of kind of the building blocks of the common law, which is another thing it's good to mention. There are two kinds of law studied in law school. You have the common law, which comes from cases, and you have statutory law that comes from code books, right? So the civil procedure code, the criminal code, the family law code, right? Those are like, I can just like go to the library and like look up a book and it's going to tell me what the law is. But there's a lot of law that is the common law, which is built over years and years of judicial opinions. And some classes are going to focus on that. And so you're kind of layering the law on top of each other to see how it would be applied in a fact pattern. So doing a deep dive into some of these famous historic cases, that like nobody's going to ask you that on your exam. It's just, that's not really the point of it. It's all about kind of understanding how it all fits together. And you want a professor to walk you through that. This stuff isn't necessarily for self-study. Like you want to, like you're going to school to have professors teach you this kind of stuff. You don't want to feel like you're doing it all before. That's why I think though, like focusing on skills is important. If you really haven't had a lot of exposure to the law, I think then just reading books that, about the law, like I mentioned, Elie Mystel's book, or, you can read books about like famous tort cases. You can, just anything that makes you kind of understand what the court system looks like. Do you understand what the court system looks like? I mean, a lot of people don't. A lot of people start law school and don't understand that with the federal system and the state system, how they go in parallel and where cases like go on their journeys. We cover that in Start Law School, right? Because I think that like, that's one of those questions that a lot of people aren't even sure. Like, how does a case get from the state court to the federal courts? I mean, that's not necessarily an easy answer for a lot of folks. And you're going to kind of want to know that kind of stuff. So don't feel like you have to learn this stuff on your own. It's not self-study. You're paying a lot of money to go and have somebody walk you through this and put it all together for you. And old famous cases are mostly just included because they're old and famous. To be honest.
Gotcha. No, that makes perfect sense. Thank you. So out of the many reasons you shared, one that really stuck out to me is that students who, let's say they Google these cases and they end up finding the long form unabridged version online, they're going to be doing a lot more reading than they actually need to do. And they're also not going to get the proper framing or the context around it. So for some beach reading that might be a little bit more consumable would be something like the books that you mentioned, books that are more for popular consumption that you might find at the front of a Barnes and Noble that talk you through, that give you a layman's perspective on the court system or the judicial system, anything like that, to give you more than you might have gotten from watching Suits, let's say.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I like Suits, but that's not going to give you a great background.
There's a couple more. Yeah. There's a couple more questions in the chat.
Yes, I'm seeing that. So do you have more scenarios online that we could practice with, similar to the ones I've given us? Absolutely. So on the podcast, those listen and learn episodes that I mentioned, what I do is I explain a tiny bit of law, and then I give you hypotheticals that apply that law. And I think that if you're looking to just get some kind of basic high-level understanding of some heavily tested, like basic law and things like evidence or torts, crim, all of that kind of stuff. Those listen and learn episodes are great. We have transcripts for all of our podcasts. So if you are someone who likes to read things, you can download the transcripts from our website. And that way you can even like edit them or think about them or look at it first on your own and then go back and listen to the episode. That's a really easy way to get a little bit of exposure. Just don't be too hard on yourself, because again, like you haven't learned it yet. So you aren't supposed to understand how all of this fits together. Someone else mentioned about getting a paralegal certificate. I don't think that a paralegal certificate is necessary to be successful in law school. I had friends who were paralegals before they went to law school, and they definitely knew a lot more about the practice of law than I did, because they'd been working in a law firm, they had been practicing law. But there is a difference between what lawyers do and what paralegals do. And so paralegals, you can have some legal writing exposure, you can have legal research exposure. So in all of that, then you're going to go into the law school experience with a lot more exposure to some of these things. But they are asking you to do something somewhat different in law school. And so if you're interested in being a paralegal, then I would go get a paralegal certificate. But if you just want to be a lawyer, I think you can just go to law school. Internships before law school. I think that especially if you have not been around lawyers or law firms or really seen how the work that you're interested in is done, I think getting an internship or some sort of exposure is a great idea before law school. I think that, you want to make sure that you are interested in that. So let's say that you're really interested in criminal law. So I am the daughter of 2 lawyers. I grew up with law being discussed in my households. I probably knew too much about too many things when I was younger because I was an only child and a lot of things were litigated in my household. I find criminal law to be incredibly interesting. I like from a scholarship aspect, I'm super interested in it. The practice is not for me for a lot of different reasons. The same thing with family law. I think family law is super interesting. I think that a lot of how it functions, practicing family law is something very specific. So I think that if you are interested in something, but you've never seen how it plays out in the real world, getting some exposure can be really helpful. You will also have plenty of time to get internships in law school. But if you're like deciding to go to law school and you've never had exposure to the legal profession, it could be nice to get a little exposure before you go to make sure that this is what you want to do and that you're moving in the right direction. There was another question about what a fact pattern is. So what I said was the snack about Officer Prowl and the radio falling out. That's a fact pattern. So fact patterns, they call them fact patterns, hypos, hypotheticals. Basically, they are just stories that professors will give you to solicit some sort of response. And the stories can get pretty silly, because they are trying to manufacture a story to get you to talk about a lot of stuff. So, in your torts class, you're going to have someone on a cruise ship who, maybe had COVID and didn't disclose it. And then they're going to trip over someone who's going to fall off the boat. And then somebody's going to try and rescue them. And then like a shark's going to come along and like hurt the person who's rescuing them. I mean, it sounds kind of silly, but I mean, it really, like, they get pretty kooky and they are not always grounded necessarily in reality, because what you're thinking about is when the professor writes a fact pattern, a hypo, an essay, prompt is the other thing that they call them, is they are creating, like, they're trying to have a conversation with you where they're saying, like, I'm going to tell you about all these different facts. And then I want you to use those facts and think about what I wanted you to talk about. And you're like, couldn't you just ask me? Like, that would be a lot more like direct, but that's not how it works, because this is the real world, right? When you practice law, a client shows up and says, I got a problem. Like, this is what happened. And your job is to say, like, okay, I listened to your story. I'm going to use my expertise and understanding of the law to tell you what is going to happen based on your story. So it really does relate to what lawyers actually do. All right. There was there's a question about the LSAT, which is really Steve's purview. But one of the things that I will say about the LSAT is, like all things, just come up with a plan of how you're going to prepare for it, and practice, and do a little bit more practice. And, use the test taking skills that you have in the past and work on your test taking skills, because law school involves a lot of exam taking, and then the mother of all exams at the end, which is the bar exam. And so the LSAT is really that first chance you have at taking kind of these higher stakes exams, and you're going to have a lot of those. And so giving it a really good shot and learning something from the experience, I think, is pretty meaningful. All right. Any other questions? Well, awesome. Well, let me, if you want to learn more about my work or the law school experience, the best place to start is my website, which is lawschooltoolbox.com. You can sign up for our mailing list, and you'll get tips directly emailed into your inbox. Like I said, we have a very popular Law School Toolbox podcast that you can listen to wherever you listen to your podcasts. And over the summer, we are going to be releasing a special 8-part series on starting law school right. So if you are starting law school in the fall, you may want to make sure that you subscribe so you get those bonus episodes throughout the summer. As I mentioned, we have a Start Law School Right on-demand course that can be done at your leisure the summer before you go to law school or whenever you're interested in starting. And we walk you through kind of the life cycle of the year of what it feels like to go into a class. And then you get to interact and get some initial feedback from our tutoring team. So you can start law school with already having a little bit of feedback on your writing and study techniques. And if you also find yourself needing one-on-one help, we have a team of experienced one-on-one law school tutors who can help you during your law school experience as well. My email is lee, Lee, at lawschooltoolbox.com, and you're always welcome to reach out to me via email or through our contact form. We do read them, and we're happy to answer other questions that may come up.
Amazingly, Will. Thank you so much for the great presentation. You covered far more topics and points than I could possibly have imagined. Exceed my expectations. Amazing. Thank you so much. I definitely encourage folks to check out the podcast. I put the link to the podcast earlier in the chat. I'll copy paste it before we sign off for tonight. I'll put it right there again. Definitely check out the podcast, subscribe to it in your podcast player, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, what have you. Definitely check out lawschooltoolbox.com as well. I highly recommend signing up to stay in touch with Lee as they're releasing more information, the upcoming podcast series, the on-demand course they have, the tutoring. You may need that support, and you want to make sure you are well situated with how to get it before it's too late and you're in over your head later in this semester. So thank you again, Lee, for taking the time. I put your email in the chat as well, so folks can reach out to you directly if they have any questions. But thank you so much again. Really appreciate the time that you took tonight.
Oh, I appreciate everyone for spending some of their Sunday evening with me to talk about law school. And do reach out if you have any further questions.
Amazing. Well, thank you again, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Lee. Have a good night, everyone. Take care. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.